Welcome to the Andrew D'Angelo podcast.
Constant Constance. Each week, Andrew, renowned jazz saxophonist and brain cancer survivor, invites us to look at the many worlds of his guests, with conversations that cover all the arts, human resilience, a little bit of politics, and a lot of humour.
You can't fail to have a fantastic time.
Ready to illuminate?
I'm going to try.
All right. So hello, everyone, and welcome. Today we are here with Mr. James Gavin, who is an author and a writer, but I suppose those aren't two different things anyway, right? But you've written 5 books, one on the history of Cabaret in New York, if I remember correctly, right?
Correct.
And you've written 3 biographies, Chet Baker, Peggy Lee, and Lena Horne, and you're working on one of George Michael, which I am totally fascinated by. As I told you, I got to meet him at one point, and I told you that story. We can go there if we want. But and one of the things that you said is you want to write your books and your biographies in such depth that no one else would ever want to write a story of this person's life again. And your example was that there's like 1,000 biographies of Billie Holiday, right?
Never done Billie Holiday, but Billie Holiday is one of the small handful at this point of historic jazz figures that new generations continue to discover and be fascinated by. And the well has long since run dry. Almost no one is alive who knew Billie Holiday.
Interesting.
There really is nothing left to say about her. And yet there's a new biography contracted now on Billie Holiday. A new documentary just came out. And I'm glad, because it means that people are still interested.
Right.
In the case of George Michael, there have been a variety of what I would call superficial biographies of him that were probably done quickly. And that's not my style. I get so deeply involved with my subjects that I want to know everything about them, and I want to psychoanalyze them from every corner. And I want to, most of all, do justice to his music and to reintroduce him to the United States, because George has been out of the public eye here for a very long time.
And you mean he was out of the public eye even when he was still alive, in the US anyway, right?
Very much so. I would say that in the early 90s, George started to slip off the pedestal that he had been on, and that it had been a towering pedestal because he was the #1 pop star in the year at the time that he was on the tour for his Faith album in 1988. And that album was a monumental success. And then he released another album that I like even more called Listen Without Prejudice, Volume 1. And it was thereafter that he decided he was upset with Sony, his label, and he wanted to sue for his freedom. And he lost that suit and never regained. It took him a few years to lose that suit, but he lost that suit and he never regained his former eminence there. And pop music is ephemeral, and it's very easy to slip. It's very easy to be replaced. It happens to almost everybody. And from that point on, however, George never had another hit in the US, and all kinds of mayhem began to unravel in his personal life.
When I was speaking to a friend who's going to be on the podcast coming up, her husband, do you have that friend that fact checks everything you're fucking saying, like while you're saying it over the phone? He writes code and for Google, and when I'm talking to them on speakerphone, my friend Nicole Federici and her husband Adam Cooper, as I'm saying stuff, he'll be looking it up to make sure that I have the facts correct. And I made a comment about George Michael's, I guess demise. I don't know if it was a demise, but that's how I put it. And he looked it up, and I guess George was worth something like $105 million when he died. So financially, he was doing all right, it seems, if that's correct information.
He was. Every December brings in an enormous windfall to the George Michael estate. And songs of his were getting licensed for film and television on a regular basis. And in England, unlike in the US, he's a prince to this day. The fascination with George Michael is simply endless. He has a very special relationship with his own country and with Europe, but he's aristocratic in the UK. Deserves to be here. So that's one of my goals.
Your goal is to shine a light on what? His artistry, his music, his personal life, or his fandom or stardom? What are all those aspects, maybe?
My goal is to tell an honest story about a uniquely gifted and charismatic, but extremely troubled guy, especially in the sense of his sexuality, which I don't believe George ever came to comfortable terms with. And I believe that it's at the root of a lot of his problems, most of his problems, in fact.
So as far as his sexuality goes, what are you saying there? If you want to save it, say, read my book, you'll find out. But since, just a little side note, since we are pre-recording, I can always edit. So feel free to say, I don't want to answer that or whatever. But George Michael's sexuality, in what way are we talking here? That he was a gay man and was unwilling to admit it, or was bisexual, or I won't even put any more words in your mouth. Just curious.
Well, George is the son of a Greek Orthodox restaurateur, and the Greek Orthodox religion is very homophobic. There was a great deal of homophobia in George Michael's childhood, but there was in a lot of people's childhoods, because he was born in 1963. So he grew up in the 1970s when things were very, very different. Things were very different in the 1980s and the 1990s than they are today. But it was George's overwhelming goal as a young man to become a star. And when you make that determination and really go for it, and especially when it happens, you are signing a contract that has a lot of fine print in it that you may not be aware of. And for a variety of reasons, which I will detail in my book, George chose to stay in the closet and never came out officially. What he did was he was outed. He, in 1998, in a famous incident in a Beverly Hills men's room, after which he was arrested, suddenly the world knew. A lot of the world already knew, but they had not heard your...
I knew from personal experience.
But at that point, he had not said the words, "I am gay." And in the 1990s, that's what the public wanted to hear. There were so few out stars and out role models that there was enormous pressure especially on famous people, to come out and to come out big. And for all sorts of reasons, George didn't want to do that. What he did do, though, was, I think, almost orchestrate a way in which he could be outed by somebody else, passive aggressively, perhaps.
Wow. So that's interesting, because when I came out of the closet, I thought I was already out of the closet. So I was at a friend's wedding, and my boyfriend at the time, who made this hat, same person, Carlo Quispe, who's a cartoonist and is going to come on and talk about his work, and an illustrator. Wonderful, wonderful man. We're at my friend's wedding, 25 years ago or something, and maybe 30 years ago. And we just started dancing, and it was a slow dance. And we started, making out. And my friend, who was getting married, is a photographer. She started taking these really lovely photos. Maybe I'll flash one as you and I are chatting. And they're like, "Congratulations, you came out of the closet." I was like, "You guys all knew I was gay." But there is this, right? But there is this especially in the pop world and even in the jazz world. I read your article on homophobia in the jazz, which I would love to discuss because that's been coming up. Sexism, racism, and homophobia in the music industry in general. But I mean, it's so weird because you all knew I had a boyfriend. All my friends knew that, and it was all my close friends at the party, but they were congratulating me for coming out just because I kissed another guy, kind of in public. I mean, it was a private wedding. So how does that work for a pop star? Because I've heard things about maybe John Travolta is gay, Tom Cruise. I don't know if any of those are true, but I've heard stories that a lot of these married to women celebrities are actually, at least bisexual or maybe even full on homosexual men, but they just don't talk about it.
You remember how things were in the 90s when there were really the first big celebrity coming out incidences. And there was enormous political pressure from the gay community, primarily, for people who were gay to own up to it, so to speak, and come out, because everyone felt that it was needed. It was needed to unify and strengthen the gay community and to eliminate a message of hiding. It's always a little bit more complicated than that, of course, or a lot more complicated and difficult to do that, because coming out is really hard for a lot of people. And especially if you feel you have a great deal riding on it, and that there are people who could be hurt by that message, and pure fear of doing so over what might happen. So George was caught a little bit in the crossfire of that. It's always easy for people to say, why don't you just come out and get it over with? But the process by which George went through all of that is really fascinating. And I would say for young people of today, young gay people of today who seemingly come out with so much ease, depending on where they live, of course. I don't know how things are in rural Tennessee these days, but for the most part, certainly in big cities, young gay people feel a lot more, a lot safer doing that. But 25 years ago, it was simply another world.
You know what, James? What knocks me out sometimes is that we're only talking about 25 years ago, right? We're not talking about the 1930s or the 1800s, or in fact, I think that in the roaring 20s, it was kind of vogue to have a gay lover, but that's only from what I've heard, probably no more. It's just strange to me that we're talking about, you remember how it was in the 90s and 80s? It wasn't easy, man. And it just seems that's too not long ago to make any sense to me. That I feel like we should be, as a society, not just in America, but in the world in general, should be further along with our acceptance of people's, sexual preferences and, or, obviously race or their gender, whether they're gender neutral. I'm having this good friend of mine I've known about 30 years, Red Robinson, and she holds these play parties, and she insists on calling it queer now, instead of labeling somebody gay or homosexual or lesbian, or transgender or whatever, bisexual. She just calls us queer. And I find that very interesting because that was a super derogatory term when I was growing up.
Not anymore. I'm in favor of as few labels as possible, because I think that it breeds division, and very often those groups wind up pitted against one another, which is the opposite of the alleged goal of inventing 150 different categories and subcategories and subcategories, which I find boring, for one thing. There is simply no way to keep track of all these labels. And I often ask myself, what's in a name? Does it really matter? Is it really making any difference? Or is it just whipping up a lot more confusion and hostility, which I believe it is.
Well, let's ask this question. So, and I'll do it via my own story. I started a band, a trio, and called it Gay Disco. And the reason I called it Gay Disco, one is because I just thought that was pretty, fun and hilarious name. But also I wanted to be able to have somebody announce the band on stage at a festival or something. Ladies and gentlemen, Andrew D'Angelo and Gay Disco. I think that's great. It opens up, right? It opens up this whole door. And so I announced that my band Gay Disco is putting out their first record. I believe it was in about 2008, maybe, and 2007. Funny, I don't know what year that record came out. And I got an email through my website from Out Magazine, which has now become Popnography. What's it called? It's close to pornography, but it's called Popnography or something like this.
I didn't know that. Has Out Magazine been absorbed by somebody else or changed its name?
They just went online and made it more convenient for the online community. But anyway, the editor, and I believe owner of the magazine at that time, wrote me this very vicious email about how dare you make fun of the gay community and you're homophobic and all of these really, nasty things. I said, wait, but I'm gay. That's the whole reason. And then he writes me back. He goes, oh, well, you're gay? I was like, yeah. So we go back and forth, and they end up doing this nice feature on me and stuff, and saying what a great idea it was to call it, have Andrew call his band Gay Disco. But the reality is, the record label did not like that name, and they wouldn't let me call the records Gay Disco.
What happened to that album? Tell me.
In what way?
After it was released, how was it released, and then what was the reception to it?
I won't drop any names here, because I don't think that's important. It's a record called Skadrodagus. So I couldn't call it Gay Disco, so I just made up a word and a title that nobody could remember out of rebellion. And as far as the reception, at one time there was a copycat band in Boston of some, I think, Berkeley kids or New England Conservatory that they called themselves Gay Disco and would play my songs and their own songs. So it was well received. And I actually still sell that record to this day, some 12, 13 years later. But here's the point, is that interesting. I just want to call a record Gay Disco because I'm a gay man and that's the life I've had. And the label's like, we're not really that into it for whatever reason. So I call it Skadrodagus, which you really have to kind of memorize that, unless you have one of those minds but everybody still knows it's Gay Disco. So I'm very proud that somehow that came through. But I'm also, when I think about what you said about George Michael or even any pop star or celebrity, they have so much at stake. I mean, if we're talking about a contract for, how many millions of dollars, and if you come out publicly and it ruins your career, which is unfortunate, but it's possible that could happen. I think that's what you were saying when you said there's a lot at stake, right? We're talking about money, not just, right, persona.
Well, interestingly, when George Michael was acknowledged as a gay man, from that point on, it seems to me, he didn't lose one iota of his following in the UK. And his concerts, which were arena concerts, were still filled with adoring women. And he was still having #1 albums and a couple of #1 singles even in the UK, whereby in the US, I feel his decline didn't have anything much to do with that. His commercial decline, because that occurred when the Beverly Hills restroom incident took place. That was 1998, and George by that time was already way past his commercial heyday in the US. So we can't blame his American decline on sexual matters. But I remember very well when that incident in April of 98, as I said, broke. And it really was breaking news at the time because something like that was really scandalous. George Michael was or had been a superstar. And superstars didn't generally do stuff like this. And also, the rumors had been circulating for so many years that this was viewed as a shameful way of coming out. It's all complicated and fascinating. The psychology of this story is so interesting to me, and that's what always draws me into my subjects, because first of all, I want music that touches my heart and that signals some kind of rich and complicated inner life that I want to get to understand better. And that becomes my job, to see how the music making and the social, the psychological turmoil intertwine. I don't have a psychological degree, but on the other hand, I'm pretty good. I've been doing this for such a long time, and I have a lot of ideas in George's case. These great artists are so complicated. There are so many layers to peel away, and you can pick up a record or look at a performance in so many different ways. So I'm coming to the end of my journey with that. I'm in the last stages of it.
And where can people, when the book is published, you have a publisher? Is that all settled?
Yeah, Abrams is my publisher.
Abrams
Wonderful New York publisher. And I just have to finish the damn thing. It's been a long road. I've been working on this for a few years now. I've been working on it since the year after he died. He died in 2016, and I started this in 2017. But I don't turn him out fast, because I, again, become so wrapped up in my subjects that I want to turn over the world and shake it to find every last little bit of tidbit of information that might shed light on who this person really was.
It almost as if you want to become them so that you understand exactly who they were.
Well, that's a very good point, because in my opinion, if you're writing one of these books, there is one thing that you must have, or rather that you must find in yourself, and that's empathy. Everything is about empathy in the end, because if you don't have that, you will have dry history, dry storytelling, or possibly hostility. It's very common for biographers to become impatient with their subjects, start sounding judgy, and it's a trap that you cannot fall into. You have got to look at this person's life and choices, and while not being an apologist, I don't ever want to be that, you have to understand why. Why is the big question. And it helps a lot if you can look at your own life and find things in your own life that help you to understand, that give you a sense of having been there.
To me, it has something to do with what they call in the legal world discovery. So if you're involved in a lawsuit of some sort, and people will understand this who've been through it, you basically have to open all your doors and closets, and they look at everything, your taxes. And I think any of us, if somebody was to dig into our lives and write a judgmental, as you said, and sometimes very critical and even negative, we all have done something, at least one thing, that somebody could pick apart. And when I was talking to Red Robinson the other day about our podcast interview, she has stories. I mean, because she's had these play parties for decades. And the stories, George Michael having sex in the bathroom, come on. This is just one little thing that happened in somebody's famous life, right? But we all have, except for maybe some of our moms who have, never given a blowjob. I actually have proof of that, who are in their 70s or 80s, I've never had oral sex. It's like, how is that even possible? But I guess it is possible. But there's a skeleton in everybody's closet. And one of the things that we've obviously figured out through the advent of social media is people love to focus on the negative. They love to talk about what's wrong instead of what's right.
Yeah, it really gets me down, and I can't deal with it. This past year in particular has been a year in which I have worked so hard to eliminate negativity from my life. Negative people, negative input. We're just drowning in it these days.
Yeah.
And it's not good. It's not a good way to live, because it colors your entire existence. It colors your thinking. It colors your choices. It colors your relationships. And it doesn't lead to, I'm not talking about fighting the good fight, or being as well informed as you can possibly be. I'm talking about a negative way of looking at life and the world and other people. That's bad. I think it's bad, and it can really affect the way you feel when you look in the mirror in the morning.
Amen. And beautifully said, James. I've had two experiences on this show. I had Nikki Hamid on the other day. Nikki was born in 1941 and lives in New Zealand. And they call him the professor of happiness. And we literally sat there for an hour. I don't remember, an hour, longer than an hour, but the edit will be about an hour. And I'm just listening to him, this man in that age and that point in his life, just being so positive and so loving and so kind, that I was like, wow, I don't know. I just want to listen to you, sir, and hear your wisdom. And then I did one with Barney McCall. Do you know him? Pianist,
Yes.
Australian
Yes.
pianist.
Yes, of course.
And I actually asked him a provocative question that was, I'll admit, it was somewhat negative. And he goes, well, Andrew, I'm doing this 30-day positive thinking challenge, so I'm not going to answer that question. I was like, fair enough. And it seems to be that with, as you said, the disparaging world of social media and our sometimes inability not to get sucked in by the news or by this political situation or this, I don't know, scandal, it what wins? Does light and love and positivity win over darkness and death and negativity? I don't know. I just understand that it's important that we love and support each other and help each other have the best life that we possibly can, considering our circumstances, whatever those might be.
Well, without sounding too new agey, I really do believe in energies. I believe that the actions we make and the things we say and our attitude radiates out from us. And I think that those energies live. I think that they exist and they travel and they have consequences. And it really helps if you can put out as much positivity as possible. I say all this as someone who absolutely loves sad songs, who grew up in a quite melancholy atmosphere in Yonkers. That's where I grew up. I was born in Manhattan, but adopted, and my adoptive parents took me off to Yonkers, where I lived for the first 22 years of my life. And things were not so good at home. And I responded deeply from the age of 5 to sad songs and songs about loneliness and abandonment and things like that. Really spoke to me, and they do to this day in a way that is home for me even now. But I'll backtrack what I just said and say it's not really home for me in the sense that I don't live there anymore. I used to absolutely wallow in melancholy, and I don't think that I do anymore, and I don't think that that's what I radiate. I think I've moved beyond it. But when I hear June Christie singing sad songs, I'm galvanized instantly because I relate to it so well.
First of all, don't worry about sounding new agey or not, because that's kind of a theme that's been running throughout this podcast. And I'm having an astrologer on in a couple of weeks. And Nikki Hamid, who is, he said, play devil's advocate. And I said, well, if somebody was watching me talk to you, although I wasn't really talking to Nikki, I was more listening. How can we bring them in? When you, James, talked about how our energy travels, right? And I understand this because, when I had brain cancer, I went to all these alternative healers, and I don't know why they call them alternative. To me, they're actually as healing as a medical doctor. And a lot of them said that I had resentment, that I didn't love myself, and that had to start to affect my body, and the cancer developed because I had resentment and anger. And I was like, And they said, well, try to learn to love yourself. This is not easy for a lot of people to love themselves. And so to me, that focusing on this negativity or this derangement or this sociopath or whatever they're focusing on is, can that person, like you said, James, go in the mirror and say, I love you? And I'm talking about loving themselves, not egotistically, just can you say, I love you to yourself in a way that's, like you would nurture a child or something, or a pet.
That's profound. And I agree 100%. I have a friend in Santa Barbara named Richard Lamparsky. Richard is in his 80s, and he's the author of many books in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and beyond. He's a very wise man, and I love our long late-night conversations. And I have tacked to my refrigerator, in fact, and I can paraphrase what he wrote to me once in a letter. He said, I'm paraphrasing. He said, the older I get, the more I know, not think, but know, and he underlined know, is that the bottom line on all of us is, and this he underlines, what we think about ourselves.
There was a beautiful, that's absolutely beautiful quote. And there's I'm getting caught off guard because it wasn't something I expected to speak to. Oh, it's called Radical Forgiveness. And the author, and if we really want to get deep, I'll go grab it and we can really get thorough, but I can always flash it on the screen and it'll be okay.
Okay.
And in Radical Forgiveness, the author talks about that voice in your head and what's it saying to you. What are those things? What are you making up in your head? Are you making up that you're beautiful, that you're successful in whatever success and beauty means to a person? I'm not going to judge that. Are you healthy? Are you happy? Because I think a lot of people that I've run into are walking around going, God, I sucked on that gig, or, oh shit, I don't like that, chapter in my book. I got to fix that. Or I'm no good. I can't do this, Broadway show. I don't know why they like me in the audition, right? We all do that. And this is that voice in your head, and which I really got deep into when I read this Radical Forgiveness book, I was like, oh shit, I'm walking around making stuff up, just about whatever. And it sometimes it can be super negative.
Well, yeah, one of the motors that drove me, I'm sure, probably came out of negative stuff. It came out of a deep determination to prove to the world that I was worth a damn, that I belonged here on earth, that I could do this even if other people felt that I couldn't. I'm talking about the writing of my first book now. It probably had negative roots, and over time, as the decades passed, a couple of decades since then, I began to feel a little bit more at ease, and I wasn't as desperate as I was to prove to everybody that I had value. I would say probably much, if not most, great art that I value came out of those turbulent feelings. It did not come out of a place of sharing and loving feelings and so forth. I think it comes out of much darker places than that. But I find great comfort in all of that music. As I said, I love sad songs. From looking around me, you can see that I have a lot of media in this little apartment here on the Upper West Side.
Yeah.
And I love voices. I fell in love with music because of voices and singers, because they felt voices on records felt very real to me. They felt like my friends. And it made my childhood a lot less lonely to put on an album and to hear someone singing to me. And then it was over time that I fell in love almost equally with instrumentalists who could play with a singing quality. If I felt a sense of story and narration in their playing that transcended words, that captivated me. And so music for me, as for most people, I guess, who love it, it has saved me in various ways, and it gave me my life, without a doubt.
Wow. That's beautiful. I think it's okay for people. I mean, this is a whole philosophical discussion in and of itself, talking about what motivates us and what pushed us to, in your case, writing your first book, and in my case, putting out my first record, where people were saying, "Oh, you're too young, you're not good enough." I was like, "Yeah, but I'm going to do it anyway." And in fact, since you said that, fuck you. I'm now I really want to put it out, you know. And but it's that whole, you know, idea of, and I again, you know, tossing out the new age label. It's like calling somebody, you know, gay or homosexual or lesbian. It doesn't really matter to me, but it's okay to look at your shadow self. It's okay to visit that place. If you didn't have a great childhood, which it sounds like that's what you're saying, but we don't have to get personal. Or I had a pretty darn good childhood with some turbulent moments. We can visit those. We can look at that shadow and maybe cry, or, you know, punch the wall, or do what we have to do to release that energy. I think that's the important thing. There's one thing to look at our shadow and explore it. And like you said, listen to some somber music or melancholy and do some crying, or just like curl up next to the fire and be like, "Oh, that was such a terrible time." But then there's a difference where you live in that place. Not you, but anybody. When we stay in that place, then I'm not so interested in that myself. I don't know about you.
It took me a very long time to realize that it feels better to feel good than to feel bad.
Interesting.
Feeling bad is very romantic, and so much great art, great films and great songs and books and so forth, plays have come out of people who were feeling bad. But it's not the kind of energy that I'm drawn to anymore. It's not productive. It saps my energy. It drags me down. It leaves me on the sofa with the comforter pulled up to my chin at 7 o'clock at night. It's not working for me anymore. But I can always, having grown up the way that I did, I have these antennae, and my antennae vibrate in the presence of that energy. So if I meet you and know nothing about you, but I sense that you have been through some serious trouble or have a deep strain of melancholy or something going in you, I will sense that behind your smile, and I will be drawn to that. And it has everything to do with why I've chosen the subjects I've chosen to write about.
That was beautifully said, sir. Thank you.
Thanks.
So one of the things I wanted to share with you that I thought about was when I had brain cancer and a terminal diagnosis of, they said 6 to 8 months, whatever. But I was like, I don't know, put on a happy face and just live my life. And, you know, if I'm going to die, I'm going to die, but I'm not going to die in depression or darkness. And my friends and family were very concerned that I wasn't concerned enough. Like, man, you should be freaking out. I was like, well, I mean, I can't say that I never freaked out, especially at night when I'm laying there and, I've had several brain surgeries and I'm like, this is crazy. But for the most part, I was keeping a pretty positive attitude, and it did, freak out some of my, colleagues who pretty much thought I was finished, but I even in that context, facing death, I was like, yeah, well, I mean, if I'm going to die, I might, and believe me, I wasn't doing drugs or any drinking or anything like that at that time. But I did have fun. I was like, I might as well have fun,
When was it? I know you've talked about this before, but I'd love to hear you tell us now the moment when you realized you were not going to die.
So once I had the 2 brain surgeries and the doctor said, I think we bought you some time. You might live a year. You might live 14 months. But now you need to do chemo and radiation. And I was like, would I die anyway? And they're like, yeah, you're going to die from brain cancer, but this might buy you a little bit of time. I was like, fuck it. I don't want to do that. So I started looking for healers, and I found this healer actually in New York, in Manhattan, named Peter Roth, who's going to be on the show. And I went to see him and for these sessions. But the first session, I'll never forget. He, empath, intuition. He hates the word psychic, but whatever term you want to use, he understands. He's a intuitive healer, is what he called himself then. And he was looking at my energy, as you spoke to, as you and I both understand about energy. And he goes, oh, you chose to have brain cancer. You just need to learn what cancer has to teach you, and you're going to be fine. And he goes, actually, you're not going to be just fine. You're going to be whole again. And the reason I know this is he would record every session and give me a copy of the recording. And so I went back and listened to that session, and he's like, yeah, you're going to be fine. But he was one of maybe 5 people who were cheering me on. I mean, my own sister had been planning my own funeral. A bunch of my friends who are now very well-known musicians were saying, oh yeah, we had you as good as dead. We thought you were in denial. And so I would say that was the moment. And we're making this documentary and so on and so forth. So I've had to go back and make sure I have this story correct. But for me, that was the moment. Peter Roth, 2008, after March, maybe April or May. And he was, yeah, you're going to be fine. You just need to understand why cancer, which as I think I mentioned to you, I know I mentioned it to people, was resentment and anger and self-hatred. And so I worked hard. I worked really hard to understand why I hated myself so much. And that wasn't easy.
How many years ago was that?
2008.
Fantastic.
Thank you. I feel bad because I've been kind of bringing it up, but it was a pinnacle moment in my life. So, and it's when I understood that, you can literally hate yourself to death. And that's basically what I had been doing my entire 20s, 30s, was just hating myself to death. And then all of a sudden death came and said, all right, here's what you asked for. You hate yourself, and you're going to kill yourself. And I know there's a lot of people who disagree with how I view and other people view cancer. But there's this woman who had this website called Suicide by Cancer. And she believes that people are literally killing themselves slowly by getting that disease. And it's purposeful and it's intentional. And I think she has since taken her website down, and because she got so much hate about this. But I feel like I've talked a lot there. So
very important point, though. How do you make people love themselves? How do you teach them that they're worth saving? I often wonder about that, because I have seen I've been around the jazz world quite a bit, among other worlds, and I've seen people die of bitterness.
Mm-hmm.
And I often wonder, what would it have taken to turn them around? Could they have been turned around? Or were they so determined? Were they clinging to that bitterness so intently that it was just impossible to change anything?
Yeah, I mean, that is a very, very, very big question. And there are several schools of thought on what that is. In other words, if somebody dies of a drug overdose, was it the drugs that killed them, or did they just reach a point in their bitterness and, weary state that they just got to a point where they were trying to numb so much that it just finally took them out? Or was it really just an accident and that the drugs just happened to be the wrong time, wrong place? I tend to lean towards we're all making choices at all times. Just like we made a choice this day, this time to meet and talk. Cancer came to me because I asked cancer to come to me, and I needed to look at that and understand it. And believe me, James, I have met so much resistance to those kind of to that kind of commentary and that kind of feeling or thinking. To me, it's a feeling. It's not a thinking. I'm feeling the energy of bitterness and resentment, and is like, is that the way you want to go out? Andrew's like, no. So there was no real social media back then, so I'm writing on my blog like, I'm healed, I'm healthy, I'm doing well. And I would get these messages from people like, you're in denial, and what are you doing, and you're just being stupid. I'm combining a bunch of different ones. I was like, I'm just manifesting my destiny here. I want to be healthy. I am healthy. I'm not going to say I want to be, because I am healthy. I am well. I am healed. I am alive in 10 years, 20 years. I'm doing well. And so I ended up taking those down because I just didn't know how to handle these. One woman sent me, I swear it was 10 paragraphs of just how I needed to look at reality and get ready to meet God. And you're just, these healing modalities are total BS. And I mean, she really crawled up my, up my ass. I was like, I have brain cancer. Why are you yelling at me? I mean, give me a hug or something, right? To me, that's a very long answer to, if I see that in somebody, and if I had the chance, I would hug them and just say, I understand that you have, you're going through something and you feel like the heroin is helping or whatever it is they're doing, but I love you. And if you need to talk or you want to be with me, and maybe you can find another way to perceive yourself.
Man, it can be hard.
Yeah.
I haven't had a struggle like that in my life. My father drank, so I grew up with a template of what I did not want to be. And I was a very determined kid. And when I set my mind to something, I really went for it. And I decided at the age of about 7 years old that I was never going to be that way. And so I don't touch alcohol. I've not even experimented with drugs. I've written about some major drug addicts, which I've done more as a research job and drawing upon what I observed in my father and his years of addiction. But I guess I was one of the lucky ones because I did not have self-destruction built into me from my childhood. I ran screaming in the other direction.
But that's what ties into what you were saying before the break about this. Sometimes these situations, as with your father, and I'm assuming your adopted father, right?
Yes.
Just to be clear in my mind, is that sometimes those situations push us in the direction that we want to go in and can become, positive because they help us become something other than what we were seeing as perceived negative. Whereas in reality, your father probably just hated himself or something along these lines, right? Yeah.
Yes.
It's not really about the alcohol or the drugs or whatever people are into, or the, whatever kind of, mutilation people are doing to themselves. It's about the emotion and the dimensions behind why somebody is doing this to themselves, and the self-destruction. And so, I applaud you. I don't know you that well. We're just getting to know each other, but I applaud you that you were able to see that and make this big shift in your DNA and your energy, and project that out into the world and create positivity. I think that's a wonderful thing.
Thank you. Thank you for that. What it might have been is a kind of bossy determination to show the world that I was better than that. I think that is what it was. That was always my attitude in my early years in grade school and high school. It was like, one hand on the hip, with a little shimmy, saying, I'm smarter than you. I'm more determined than you. And I know I thought those things. I don't think them so much anymore. I don't walk around thinking those things anymore. But you said something a moment ago that's very important in my life, and that is the word choice. I was in therapy from 2002 to 2009. 2002, 3, and 4 were very low years for me, really bad. I struggled with the worst depression I've had in my life, and things were not going well for me then. And my therapist said something to me that really did change my life. I was arguing with him about the notion of choice. I said, I feel that I was fated to do what I do, and there's nothing else that I could have done. And he argued me on that. He said every moment of every day is a matter of choice. You can take paths A, B, or C. And it was an incredibly liberating epiphany that I had when he said that. I really connected with it, because at that moment you are free. Suddenly the sense of blame is removed from your life. You take responsibility for everything that's happened to you, for better and for worse. And you feel a sense of control over your life that is really marvelous. What I have seen throughout my life, especially in a place like jazz, is a tremendous sense of finger pointing and blame of other people for why things did not go a certain way for you. And that is a dangerous way to think, because it takes away all your control and it makes you bitter. And it also strips you of a sense that you can reroute your life if you want to. If it's always somebody else's fault, then nothing's going to change for you.
So yes, so eloquent and beautifully said. And I guess that is another way of saying that when I was told that I chose cancer, it freed me. So once I realized, I made this choice, so therefore I can affect the outcome of that choice, because that's also a choice. But I swear to you, James, even in this current day time of December 2020, I can hear people being disagreeing with that kind of understanding that I have and that you have. And because, well, I didn't choose my parents. I was like, well, maybe on some level you did. And if you didn't like them, maybe, you need to understand that. And then you can be the person that you want to be if you didn't like your parents, let's say. And even you as being adopted, on some level, even though you were a kid, my understanding and what I've learned is that we all make these choices, and I'm getting anxious because I can feel people writing comments to me, but it's okay. I can stand by it. I'm alive. And that's the part that I have. There's my, we used to say trump card, but we can't say that anymore. So there's my, hey, yeah, but I didn't die from brain cancer because I understood that I asked it to come, and it was my choice, and it was my choice how I dealt with it. And I'm here over 10 years later.
Hey, how did it feel when you started to play again? Did it feel different?
Very, very popular question towards me. And trying to describe the difference, I just refer to it as brain. That's what I call that period, brain. The before and after of my music is like trying to describe one of your books. I'd have to read it. You'd have to listen to my music before and after to understand the difference. Putting it into words has proven complicated for me. But if you're asking how it felt personally to me, it was insane. I felt like I'd lost my mind. I mean, I really didn't have my identity. I didn't know who I was before I had brain cancer and the brain, maybe mostly the brain surgeries. And I had to find I had to find out who I was previously or just become a completely different person, which is what I think happened with me. But I don't know, James. I think people I'd have to do an A/B with, here's a song I wrote when I was 28, and here's a song I wrote when I was 48. You tell me the difference, if there is any. Yes. If that's a fair answer. I know it's not probably the answer that you were looking for, but I just don't know how to describe it.
I had always thought of free jazz as having been born of an age of turmoil, when roots were being torn up and things and people were in tremendous conflict, and the world was kind of spinning out of control. And I always thought of free, let's say a free saxophonist. I always thought that he was the voice of that. And I don't know if you agree with that at all, or if you feel that has any bearing on the way you came to that music.
The answer is yes. But also one thing that's coming to me here, and I don't know how much of my music you've listened to, and it's okay if you haven't listened to much or a lot, it doesn't really matter. But
yeah.
I am more into Careless Whisper than I am into quote unquote free jazz from the 1960s. Let's put it that way. Yes. I would rather just hold people and caress them, and non-sexually just hold them and pet their head or hug them if they want, and give them love and give them light and give them positivity. And it's something that, because of my history, I haven't been able to shake the whole free jazz saxophonist thing. I was like, I haven't recorded a record like that in years. I mean, most of the music I'm putting out now is just what I consider to be, sometimes very composed, but also just completely pretty, and in my opinion anyway, and full of love. And not that free jazz can't be that, but I just don't hear the screaming anymore. I don't hear the squawking. I don't hear the fuck you anymore. It's just not where I'm at. And yes, that music bore out of that energy and the conflict and all the turmoil in the world, which is kind of what's happening again now. But I'll be very curious to see what music after this is over, if it ever is completely over, meaning the pandemic, but also the politics in the US and in Peru and so forth, and Brazil. When we come out of this, what the music will be. I'll be very curious.
I haven't seen the effects of it happening yet.
No, but there's a great article about that where everybody's like, man, where's the music of 2020, the pandemic? Well, when you think about it, a lot of the music about the Vietnam War came after the fact. It wasn't during the war that we got that music. It was after, or after what they were talking about, World War I, maybe, or something. And then we got all this music because people just wanted to forget about the war, and they wanted to dance, and they wanted to party. So I don't think we've seen the music from this yet. That's my opinion.
No, neither do I. I'm very curious, because this is the greatest year of turmoil in my life. I've never been alive to see anything like this before, and we're in the middle of it, so we can't really analyze it with the perspective that we need. That will come much later.
I don't know if you saw my post about this, but somebody was talking about the Great Depression and trying to compare it to now. And I have a neighbor who's turning 96. Okay, so she's almost 100. And she called right before this, actually, and we talked for a minute. And I asked her, I said, I'm not going to use her name because I'm not allowed to. I said, I mean, you went through the Great Depression, you went through World War II, her husband served in the war, the Vietnam War, JFK assassination, 9/11, civil rights, women's movement, all of this, right? So on and so forth. And I said, how does this current situation, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic of 2020, compare to everything you've been through? She goes, oh, this is much worse. This is absolutely the scariest thing I've ever experienced in my life. I'm like, okay. What do you say to that? You're talking to somebody who's from the early 1900s and they said, nah, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. You're like, all right, then. So what do we do now? And she's a super positive lady. So it wasn't like she was being negative, but she is afraid to leave the house. She's afraid if she gets the virus that she's done. And, she hasn't been seeing her family. She has her birthday coming up and the holidays and, very depressed that she can't see anybody and she's lonely. So I just thought, well, if there isn't some like major credence in a woman of that stature and of that age saying, no, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life. You kind of got to look at that. Right? What? I lost your sound. Did you turn off your sound?
No.
Okay, you're back. Go.
I'm one of the luckiest guys that I know. If I were in severe financial peril, which I'm not, normally I am, but I'm not right now. This year I've been okay. If that were the case, I would have a much darker view of life right now than I have. But I'm doing what I would have been doing anyway. I'm finishing my book. I'm doing my articles and freelance writing jobs. I'm exercising every day. I have edited my life. I think a lot of people are probably doing this right now, getting a sense of what they can live without and what really matters. A lot of people are throwing things away, which feels good. I have gotten a lot of good stuff out of this year that I would not have had if I had not been forced to rethink my life. We're not forced to rethink our lives, then we don't rethink our lives.
Right.
And so I've come out of this year better than I was in January in almost every way. But I don't want it to sound like I'm gloating because I know an enormous number of people who are not dealing with this well at all. So I try to have a shoulder for those people. And every day, pretty much every day, I send an email or I make a call to somebody, a checking in call and finding out how they're doing, which I think is really important. People have done it for me. I know how good it feels. So I'm ending this year in good shape. You are too, obviously.
I first of all, don't see it as gloating. I think it's important that every discussion we have, and certainly on this podcast where people are, having different, perceptions of how the pandemic has affected. I mean, I'm having, these very famous, well-known people on the show who are musicians who their career has basically stopped, at least on hold. And these are people on the road 8-10 months out of the year, and it's over. And it's been over now for almost a year. And that's a reality that they're facing. But for me, also touring, blah, blah, blah. But yeah, it's been actually kind of incredible. I can't say I haven't had my dark moments, but I get to stay home and, you know, generate income and write music and play music, or even just watch a Netflix series. Or like you said, I've been talking to people. I've been on the phone upwards of 8-10 hours a day sometimes, just chatting, which is why I started the podcast. I was like, well, I might as well just record it. If I'm going to be on the phone for this amount of time, I might as well just record it and share it with everybody. So same here. But I do understand. I did a Zoom a few weeks ago. I think there was about 40 people on it. And one of the things I said to everybody was, are you familiar with the law of attraction? The secret, yeah. Right?
Yes.
It was based around that. And I just jumped in and took a lot of time. And I said, look, if you haven't finished that novel or that symphony or that opera or that movie that you wanted to write or whatever it is, it's okay. I mean, one girl who spoke up, and I call her girl because she was probably 22. So one young lady from India said she's living with her 5 brothers and her mom in this small place in India. And she goes, well, I just really want to get my book done. I was like, what the hell? I mean, okay, first of all, that's amazing that you can even be in that environment in general, never mind a plague, and never mind that you might be on lockdown or in quarantine, never mind any of that. So don't beat yourself up. It'll come when it comes, and that's okay.
Right on. I'm lazier than I should be. I probably waste a lot of time in the course of the day, but I'm moving pretty rapidly towards the end of my work with George. And I have high hopes for this book. I think that his story will touch a lot of people. Ultimately, he lost the fight, of course, and he did not learn how to love himself the way other people loved him and do to this day. But I think that in general, when people hear the name George Michael, they have happy feelings. His name immediately signals songs of George's that were important in their lives that they can still sing.
I mean, Careless Whisper, the sax solo, I mean, I can bring that up as I did last night with my friends when we were talking. And my friend Nicole just started singing it. And then Adam looked it up on the internet, started playing a recording. And then we were just having I mean, that sax solo has just lived and lived and lived. It's amazing.
It's remarkable to me. I think a lot about posterity, and it's too early for me to be thinking about what I will leave behind, because I hopefully have a lot of good work left in me. But I think about what lasts and what is rediscovered by new generations, and that word immortality that so many people aspire to. And so little stuff really lasts, and especially in pop music, the vast majority of pop music fades away, and it's maybe spoke to the moment that it happened, but then time marches on and it doesn't matter anymore. And yet there are things that George did that still touch hearts and still matter a lot to a lot of people. And you can put a 21 or 22-year-old in front of a lot of his old work, and the chances are pretty good that they'll get something out of it. That's really remarkable. What an achievement.
It's impressive. And you said, what will be the indelible mark that you leave on the world, but yet you still have time. So who knows, because that mark could be coming, that achievement or whatever you decide to do. But the reality is, to have such an impact on culture is what impresses me about George Michael, and of course a lot of other people, and how people talk about and revel about John Coltrane, which to me is like, okay, enough already. Can we talk about people who are, doing it now, but whatever, making music now? But at the same time, it's like, man, these people, or Michael Jackson, right? Or Elvis Presley, or the Beatles, or Louis Armstrong, on and on, Fred Astaire, all these people have just left this mark, or Frank Sinatra, you know, or Duke Ellington, have just, yeah, wow, impressive. Now, the question I have is, did they understand that while they were doing it? Or was it, as you said, classic versus cutting edge? So was George Michael writing Careless Whisper and that sax solo, which, by the way, everybody, James Gavin told me was written, and the saxophone player was Steve Gregory, right?
Yes.
A lot of people don't believe me when I said, yeah, James says that solo was written out. Although it was written out, you said, in the wrong range of the saxophone, so it had to be adjusted.
It's a very interesting story about.
I'm still with you. I have to grab something so I can still hear you, and I'll just zoom in on you. Okay, just so you know. I'm still here. Talk away, James.
Oh, fine. Okay. Well, as you know, there were two versions of Careless Whisper. One of them produced by Jerry Wexler with a different saxophonist that George did not like, and I think he felt that it was too slick and not funky and soulful enough and too studio sounding, and so he redid it with he had auditions, in fact, and a saxophonist named Steve Gregory came up the winner, and history was made. So he had a tremendous sense. George's milieu was pop music, and he had enormous respect for pop music. He saw the art in pop music, which is, again, perceived to be an ephemeral art. And yet so many tracks that he made became immortal. I don't know that there's any way of controlling that. For example, one example that I love it when somebody from the past who might be considered to be corny by young, or normally corny by young people, somehow a new generation hears something cool in it, and suddenly that career is reborn. One of my favorite examples of that is Shirley Bassey. When Shirley Bassey's first big album of remixes came about, and suddenly Shirley Bassey was perceived as cool again, and played the Glastonbury Festival. And then there was a whole other album of remixes of Shirley Bassey records done by these really cool DJs. And what a wonderful thing that can happen. You can't make it happen. It's just that somehow a track comes to somebody's attention, a DJ starts playing it, it's used in a movie, on a television show, and suddenly all these people who weren't around for the original think, wow, holy shit, that's really cool.
Right. Well, but doesn't that tie into us saying that everything is a choice? And so, example given, I did a pre-interview for an episode I have coming up with a well-known musician friend of mine who became rather famous in his 20s. And so I asked him to tell that story, and he did. And I said, it sounds to me like you knew that you were going to be an icon. And he's like, yeah, I knew that. I was like, you're such an arrogant asshole. So I'm not sure, Jim. I'm really not sure. Did George Michael have an awareness that he was creating this iconic pop music? As you said, he saw it as art. And I know that Quincy Jones, when he was working with Michael Jackson and Eddie Van Halen for Thriller, I think they all pretty much understood this was going to be a hit. And that's what they were writing, a hit. They weren't writing, I wrote a song for my family and a few of my close friends, and then that's about it. They're like, nah, we're going to make this big hit, and it's going to have a video, and we're going to do all this work. And so I don't know. I don't have an answer here. I just know that there are people I speak to who are, if not famous, at least very well known, and had a serious intention of that being the case. And then I've met people who are like, I don't know how the fuck it happened. I feel very lucky and fortunate, you know?
It was one of George's express goals to create pop songs that would last, that would not be faded away through with the sands of time. And he really achieved that in a lot of
Yeah,
cases.
bravo to George, man. It's great.
There's a lot of heart in his singing. He was singing out of a place of really honest feelings. And that's what I respond to. I always have. I'm friends with the great jazz singer Helen Merrell.
Mm-hmm.
One of my favorite singers, always has been.
She's amazing.
Yeah, and I saw Helen interviewed a few years ago, and she was asked about music that she had come up with that had helped shape her. She was talking about various jazz musicians, bebop musicians, because she came up in the bebop era, and she said it had to be honest. And I loved that response. Now, what honest means to me and to you and everybody else is subjective, I guess, but I have a very, very firm sense of what honesty is in music or in art. I trust that sense. I think I'm right about it. Helen, God knows, Helen has always had it. If I were to forced to define it, nobody's forcing me to define it, but if I were forced to define it, I would say it's when you know that someone is singing out of a place of truth, and what's truth? It's just something that they've known and they feel, or they know what it feels like. It's an honest statement of their lives, and as opposed to a manufactured emotion. When I interviewed Lena Horne was the second of my biographies, and I had just over 2 hours in a hotel room with Lena Horne.
Wow.
Way back in 1994, when
Amazing.
she had her first album coming out in a few years. And Lena was talking about the fact that she had never really sold a lot of records. And she was concerned about the record company Blue Note that was releasing this new album of hers, because she didn't know how well it would sell, nor if Lena, was in step with the times at all. And I forget her exact wording, but she said, I can't be, and she talked about manufactured emotion. Basically, she talked about fake emotion, which is what that whole power ballad singing and power belting style of people like, not that she named them, but, Mariah Carey, Christina Aguilera, and all those big belting loud girls who were singing tear-jerking songs. But to me, it sounds completely fake. It's all false. I never believe a word that those women sing, but I believe every word that Lena Horne sings.
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's what we're talking about here.
Well, I mean, I understand it that we're talking about authenticity and honesty, and yet that is subjective to the listener.
Totally. Yeah.
I can only speak to myself. I mean, I feel like you're doing your best to speak to Lena Horne and or Mariah Carey, and maybe even for me, like discounting Mariah Carey or any of these other people as not authentic. I can't really do that, because I believe that they're doing what they love to do, and Mariah just wants to be a superstar, and that's why she's doing her music, and that's her choice. Do I like it? Yeah. I mean, I don't really put it on, but I don't hate it. And I know that for me, in my certain like 20s and early 30s, I was like, fuck you. And that actually came up when I was talking to this booking agent and manager, Anders Tiedman, because with my music, that's literally what I was saying. Like, get away from me. Literally, get away. And I think I did a pretty good job. And so now that I'm like, wait, no, man, I love you. Listen to my music. I want you to enjoy my music. I'm at an impasse, impasse. I've been at one for the last couple of years, and people are like, man, did Andrew turn into like Kenny G or something? I was like, no, I just really want, more than my musician friends to enjoy my music. I want my mom and her friends to enjoy my music. I want my brother and his friends and my nephews and their friends to go, oh, this is cool. I like it, or whatever. I don't want to just reach out to these, 25 people over here who understand what I'm doing, if that makes any sense. So to me, that's what the honesty is.
Yeah, and it's you're playing then in previously and now is coming from a real place. And I have a very strong sense of what that real place is when I hear it. And when I hear the absence of it, I'm really offended by that. If I feel that it's inauthentic or fake or just being done to make money or sell records in the days when people sold records. I'm repelled by that because I love the concept of honesty. Subjective, yeah, but I feel very confident in my perception of what honesty is. I really do. And the people that I've written about, years ago, I guess around 1997, I did a piece for the New York Times on Miriam Makeba, who I think was one of the great singers of the world on so many levels. But she had so much truth to impart that's timeless. She had tremendous life experience and a tremendous sense of pain and struggle mixed with an enormous drive to keep moving forward through it, and to fight against a lot of very oppressive forces that she had come up against in her life. And she was as like Lena Horne, she's seen as triumphant, but it was really it was pushing a boulder up a hill, man, because these many of these women who sang about freedom and peace lived lives with anything but lives of tremendous struggle and tremendous inner conflict. And I think that translates itself in the music into a great sense of conviction that I find very moving. The 1960s freedom singers, the folk singers and civil rights singers, move me very much, because even though they're singing out of great personal conflict and issues, and they were able to translate it musically into something that talked to the world.
Right.
For example, during the commercial break, I picked up this object that I really treasure, which is this Peter, Paul, and Mary set from a few years back, this 4-CD retrospective of Peter, Paul, and Mary. And I love Peter, Paul, and Mary. I love what they stood for. I love the purity of intention and the honesty of their music, and the fact that I believe that they really sincerely cared about making the world better. A year ago, this month, it's not happening this year, of course, but the saxophonist Paul Winter, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And he organizes this show every year called the Winter Solstice that takes place right before Christmas time.
Right.
And it's been a beloved Christmas tradition for me and many people every year. This fabulous spectacle with a dance troupe and this marvelous gospel singer of gospel and other music, but her name's Teresa Thomason. Whom I look forward to hearing every year, and a lot of world music guests, people from Brazil, Africa, and other countries, and Paul playing like an angel. And Noel Paul Stuckey of Peter, Paul, and Mary was his guest last year, over 80 now, singing, I thought, better than ever. Since Mary Travers died, Peter and Paul have done a few things, but not a whole lot. They lost their beloved third member. But that show uplifts me tremendously every year. It has a kind of purity about it that is free of narcissism. That might be the word. Look at show business. Show business is inherently narcissistic in a way, I guess. But I'm tremendously moved by that show every year because it is the best of the holidays. The holidays have not been, I don't look forward to the holidays. I haven't in many years, but that's always been a high point of the Christmas season for me because it's everything that Christmas should be.
That's beautiful. I also am not a huge fan of the holidays. And people are like, yeah, we can't be with their family for Thanksgiving. I said, I think we're okay. My family, those Thanksgivings weren't always great. So James, I can do two things here. I can wrap things up, or if you want to take another 5 and come back and then wrap things up, that's what I would prefer, but I don't want to take too much of your time.
I have no other plans today.
Okay, so here's what we're off camera now. Here's what I want to ask you. I'm going to tell my Careless Whisper story, the Norway story, okay?
Yes, you would.
I'm gonna shove it and force it, but when I was talking to my friends last night, they're like, you have to tell that story, man. And I was like, all right. So I'm gonna shove that square peg in a round hole, but it's honest. It's just it'll be scripted a little bit. And then I want to talk about just the way things can travel like that, the way George Michael, even after his death, this saxophone solo made it all the way to this tiny little town in Norway, a tiny little island. I think it's amazing. So did you decide, is it your own words from your own book or something else?
It's my own words from one of my own books.
Okay. Do you want to introduce which book and so forth? Or
this is the book, Stormy Weather, The Life of Lena Horne, published in 2009. 2009, God, that was a long time ago.
Yep.
2009, 11 years ago. Wow. Anyway, by way of preface, I will say that Lena was 77 years old and just about to make her final comeback. She had a new album that was being released on Blue Note Records. She had not been seen before the public much in years, and she was filled with indecision about that, moving forward on it. Horne met me in the lobby of the Wyndham Hotel. By her side was a Black man in his 70s, Sherman Sneed, her now feeble longtime manager. Horne lived across town, but had stayed at the hotel before and still used it sometimes for interviews. She wore a baggy white suit with a white cap and big dark glasses. Even so, she was unmistakable. The skin near flawless, the exquisite bone structure, the smile as blindingly white as ever. I felt the famous Horne jolt, and my mouth flew open. Involuntarily, I stepped back. At that moment, I understood, like never before, the power of the beautiful who live on pedestals. They inspire awe and envy. We covet or resent them. Whatever the case, they're not like the rest of us, and we don't let them forget it. Horne had seen reactions such as mine since childhood, certainly since 1933, when she entered the Cotton Club as an unknown Corrine. She, quote, couldn't sing and was a, quote, bad dancer, as she put it, yet wound up with the solo spot the other girls wanted, followed by a part in a Broadway play. 8 years later, MGM chose her as the Negro beautiful enough, in a Caucasian fashion, for white Americans to accept. The experience for Horne had not ended happily, and it showed. By the 1950s, her sweet presence in her early films was gone, replaced by a calculating, fire-spitting nightclub vixen.
Beautiful had become a permanent prefix to her name, a constant reminder of what had pushed her to the top, even as colleagues and critics proclaimed her artistry. Quote, her command of the stage and her ability to mesmerize an audience were awesome, said the singer Abby Lincoln. But no amount of hard-earned vocal finesse could outshine her looks, which, quote, weren't anything I really earned, said Horne. To her, beautiful took on a dismissive subtext. She looks good, but she can't do nothing. Peggy Moffat, a top model of the 1960s and 70s, recalled sitting among Horne's adoring audience at the Coconut Grove in Hollywood, circa 1962. I thought she hated us all, said Moffat, but she marveled at how ingeniously Horne disguised that loathing. Quote, she used it as though it were sexy. By then, the singer was also turning her wrath upon Lenny Hayden, her white husband and musical director. Lena is a very nasty woman, honey, said a fellow Hollywood beauty and Vegas headliner. Having heard such impressions, I panicked when Sherman Sneed left me alone with Horne after a brief hello. She and I took the elevator to her suite, a seemingly endless ride. But the woman who some had described as, quote, scary, wasn't that at all. She seemed warm, funny, and more than a little sad. The pressure of living as a symbol had taken its toll. Weariness showed in her movements and her voice. Once we'd sat down in her room, she spoke with a candor that startled me, a 76-year-old unburdening herself to a 30-year-old. Why am I here? Horne wondered aloud, and she wasn't talking about the interview. My kid left, my father left, my husband left, Billy Strayhorn, her best friend, left. Why am I still here? Word was that she hadn't wanted to make this album at all, that its executive producer, Shirley Cowell, an heiress and longtime benefactor of Horne's, had talked her into doing it. In the Horne myth, such stories were old news. For years, she'd claimed she'd never wanted her career. She'd succumbed to it, only to support her family or empower Black Americans. The reluctant Lena, socially responsible, yet victimized by the injustice of the times, made good copy. Over the years, she'd crafted her bio to fulfill every expectation the public had of her. Icons aren't allowed to be human beings. Now, Horne seemed too tired to maintain the old facade. Her memories were edged in regret and only fleeting pride. I was never able to enjoy this damn thing, she said of her career. It was always a hassle, a fight. Horne described herself as, quote, evil and angry and jealous and possessive, and her life had grown quite solitary. She lived alone in a spacious East Side apartment. Apart from her select public appearances, she saw few people besides her daughter, Gail Lamette Buckley, her son-in-law, Kevin, and her grandchildren. She spent most of her private time reading books, watching old movies on TV, and rueing her past. It included a stage mother who was so jealous she had once stooped to blackmailing her daughter, and the downfall of her beloved son, Teddy, who died at 30 of drug-induced kidney failure, a fate for which Horne felt guilty. We spoke for over 2 hours, during which she ruminated for minutes at a time. I never speak to people, she said with a smile, so when I'm with someone like you, I talk too much. Eventually, she turned hoarse, and I decided I'd better quit while I was ahead. Down we went to the lobby, where Sherman Sneed waited for us. Horne kissed me goodbye. I walked home, my feet barely touching the ground.
That's beautiful.
Andrew?
Thank you for sharing with us. And there's so much in there, and I encourage people to get your book in. I'll put the information so that everybody can find it. We'll figure that part out. But one of the things, just to tie it back into the earlier part of our conversation, did Lena actually say she couldn't sing or dance? Did I hear that correctly?
She said yes, that at the beginning of her career, she wasn't good. And she made it her business to learn. That to me is one of the astonishing things about Lena Horne. Lena Horne was very realistic. Lena Horne sized herself up in that early phase very accurately. She was an okay singer and certainly never known as a dancer. The Cotton Club Choreens were chosen because they were the most beautiful young Black women in Harlem. That's why you were there. But Lena had a very strong sense of what she needed to learn, and she sought out the people who would teach it to her. She did it in a very methodical fashion. And then when she went to Hollywood and was signed by MGM in 1942, Lena was surrounded by the very best people in their fields, the best costume designers, the best directors, the best makeup artists, the best vocal coaches and conductors. And she learned from all of those people. She learned exactly what she needed to know in order to become Lena Horne.
One of the interesting things I remember about our conversation the other day was that you said when, and maybe it was this time at the hotel, I'm not sure which time, but that her essence, her energy, her presence was just unmistakable. It was strong. It was vibrant. Whatever adjectives you put on it, I don't remember exactly, but there was just something about being in the same room with her that was like nothing else.
When I was a teenager, I went to see one of the early performances of Lena's triumphant one-woman show on Broadway called The Lady and Her Music. And I, of course, was among the people who were on their feet cheering at the end of that performance because we all felt so tremendously empowered by what this woman had gone through and how she had come out of it, looking more gorgeous than ever, and an absolute ball of fire and conviction and strength. That was the Lena that she wanted us to see. She didn't show us a lot of the darker side, but it was a Broadway show, and it had a purpose. And that show, especially for Black people who had come up more or less in Lena Horne's age, who knew how hard it was. And when you see someone, when you see the chosen one of your race up there on stage decades later in sensational form, looking as beautiful as you remember, it gives you a tremendous sense of hope. And that show left people feeling great. And I met her that very night. I was one of the multitudes of people who lined up at her dressing room door. Lena was giving 6 performances of a 2-hour concert per week. Wow. She did this for well over a year on Broadway. Wow. And still she would see people and sign autographs after the shows. Jeez. And I was a teenager, and I stood in her dressing room, and I told her how the last song of her show, If You Believe, from The Wiz, had given me, made me feel 10 feet tall, or like I could conquer the world, or something like that.
Right.
She said, I like to hear you say that, because you're young. And that was the first meeting with Lena Horne. And I could never have imagined that years later I would write her story. I would be the one lucky enough to tell that story, which is one of the great American stories of the 20th century.
You're talking about the Lena Horne story, not your story about Lena Horne, but Lena Horne's story. About
that panoramic, epic life that she lived that affected a lot of people.
I almost feel like asking you to give examples of how her life, or epic life, as you said, which I agree, affected people. Maybe a few examples. If you don't have any offhand, that's fine. But
I have them all offhand.
Well, but so I mean, go ahead, sir.
Them up in the index though, because my book is dedicated to a filmmaker named Gene Davis, who's no longer with us, Gene Davis. He lived in my neighborhood here on the Upper West Side. And Gene was a Black filmmaker who made documentaries about important Black artists. And he, of all people, more than anyone else, he is the one who encouraged me to write this book. And I was really scared at the beginning about being a white guy telling this heavy Black story. And Gene gave me the courage to do it. And for that reason, I dedicated this book to him.
Oh,
Wish he were still here.
you know what's nice while you're looking, James, is when I was interviewing a white male, such as you and I are, I asked people on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook if they had any questions. And one woman named Kendra asked, will you ask this person how they understand sexism in the jazz world or the music world in general? And she sent me a private message. So we went back and forth, and she said, I don't even know why I would ask a white male about sexism and racism, because they really wouldn't understand. I mean, how could they understand what that feels like? So maybe I'm trying to connect the two, and feel free to disagree, but you're saying that you felt awkward talking about the subject that you're speaking to at the moment in the book.
I was nervous because I wondered how I would be perceived, because I haven't walked a mile in those shoes. I've walked a mile in my own shoes. And to me, what I had to do was find the universality in Lena's story, so that everybody who had been through a rough time for one reason or another, or had felt ostracized, misunderstood, less than, would maybe find something to identify with in Lena's story. But at the beginning, I was intimidated by it. And I'm so glad that I got past it. I got past it because of Gene Davis. When he said that I was the right person to tell this story, I believed him and I did it.
And have you seen any, retribution or anything any pushback or anything from?
Nothing. The book was not reviewed by places like Ebony and Essence and so forth. The Black press ignored my book, which surprised me. In a way, surprised me. Disappointed me would be a better way of putting it. But I can't complain about the press, because the book got a lot of attention and it got beautiful reviews. It got the reviews of my dreams. That's not something we have any control over. And I know I wrote the book I wanted to write, and I did the very best and most honest job I could, and you can't do more than that, really. But the way that her story was received, and the fact that people felt that I had told it honestly but respectfully, meant a lot to me.
That's beautiful.
Now I want to read you a quote, and I'm going to step away for just a moment because
no problem.
I pulled out this script here. It's from 2011 through 2017. I traveled on and off with a show that I created based on. That's okay. Should we start that again?
Yeah.
From 2011 through 2017, I traveled on and off with a show that I created based on my Lena Horne book. I was the narrator and host. There was a jazz trio, and Mary Wilson, the former Supreme, Mary Wilson, sang the songs of Lena Horne and talked a bit about having known Lena back in the 60s. And we did it in a lot of performing arts centers and wonderful places. It was a great time in my life. And so I got to be on a stage in some beautiful halls talking about Lena Horne and showing video clips of Lena at her most fabulous and showing people the Lena that I came to know as a writer. Here's Gene Davis's quote. Jean grew up when Lena Horne's movies were being shown now. Much has been said about Lena at MGM and the fact that her appearances in most of the MGM musicals she did, which had all white casts because most big commercial musicals did at that time. But Lena would be presented in these little cameo appearances, often in a nightclub scene where she would get up and sing a song or two and leave. And I write about this a lot in my book because I think that the presentation of Lena in those films was perfect and fabulous. And MGM created the Lena Horne of legend. And in order to understand the impact of that, well, back in the 1940s, Black women who appeared on screen were usually depicted as maids or loose women or something. And for the Black community, for Black society to see a Black goddess on screen, well, I'll read what Jean said. Every time Lena was in a movie, we went to see it, as did every Black person I knew. She was the most beautiful creature we'd ever seen in our lives. Imagine a generation of Black women now seeing themselves as more beautiful than Greer Garson, more beautiful than Lana Turner. Lena was stubborn, glamorous, always wore high heels, and did not bow her head to anybody. So imagine how that felt if you were Black and you were not used to seeing your own depicted in show business as that. Imagine how hopeful it made you feel.
Yeah, that would be incredible. And then I had this whimsical imagery of Lena Horne still being in her heels, but at home, just looking really nice. I'm not saying she did that, folks. I have no idea. But, just like you happen upon somebody and you stop by their house and they're all dressed up and dialed in and got their heels, whatever that version for people are. I like the thought of it. That's all.
Well, anytime she appeared in public ever, this is true of Marlene Dietrich and certain other great beauties of show business, Lena honored your memories of her. You would never see Lena Horne not looking fabulous, never. And I think that's really nice.
I think it's beautiful. And well, I get a little bit of grief from my friends because we'll just have a casual, and this is not during COVID so much, but we'll have a casual encounter. We'll have a coffee or we'll meet for some food and a drink or whatever. And they're like, why are you so dressed up? And I was like, I'm not dressed up. I just like, looking put together. You rarely see me in a hoodie and, a shitty baseball cap or a t-shirt and jeans. I do. Obviously when we're home and, loping around or whatever. Yeah, sure. But I also have this fascination with makeup and thought about learning how to do it so I could put on makeup before my show. Because you were talking about Lena and her makeup. Weren't you talking about that, or is this something that?
Well, I did say that back at MGM, she had special makeup needs because she was Black, very light-skinned, but they had not had to make up a woman like Lena before that.
Prior.
And so the success with which they did that is obvious in every movie that she made for MGM because she's a goddess, she's a deity up there. And
she is.
Yes.
And her eyes are just incredible. And you cannot change somebody's eye. I'm not talking about their eyelashes or around. Her eyes are just, I don't know. It's as if they're emitting some kind of laser or energy. It really blows my mind. So maybe that's part of the makeup is making sure that her eyes are the focus and the feature. I don't know, maybe.
But it's something that radiates from within. There were many Lena Horne impersonators, imitators through the years because she was so heavily stylized that a lot of younger women tried to be Lena Horne. Essentially, it didn't usually work out too well. And Lena was a very smart cookie, and she looked around and she knew who was copying Lena Horne. And she said something to the effect of, about those other girls. She said, well, they don't know what I'm thinking. And what she was thinking is the fire. That's what came out of those eyes. And that was hers and nobody else's. That's why imitation doesn't usually work out so well.
Yeah, well, but for somebody to be so interesting and revered that people want to imitate them, I think that is a beautiful thing. I really find that endearing. I find it respectful, and it may or may not be possible. We could have that conversation, but it's not necessary at this moment. But just the fact that people want to replicate Lena Horne or the Elvis impersonators. I know a lot of people don't like Elvis, whatever, whoever, pick your artist. I think it's kind of neat that people want to do this.
Well, yeah, it's the sincerest form of flattery. It's true. I don't think that it often results in really compelling art if you're doing somebody else. And nobody could do Lena. Nobody could really do Peggy Lee. Very influential singer, but the strange psychology of Peggy Lee and what she was feeling inside were absolutely unique to Peggy Lee. So if you were a female singer, yes, you could try and sing in a soft, intimate, confident.
There's no way to be Peggy Lee. That woman is unreplicable. There is no copy machine that could duplicate that human, that soul, that essence. And I'm not talking about her music. I'm just talking about the whole package. No way.
I wholeheartedly agree with you. Yeah, and I've heard a lot of people try. But again, she didn't sing that way because she decided to whip up a style that was interesting and new. She sang that way because that's the way it came out. There were choices in artistry, and she knew the effect of singing soft. And certainly when she was a big band singer with Benny Goodman, Peggy knew in that raucous atmosphere of a ballroom with a big band playing for dancing, she learned pretty quickly that when she sang very softly, that rather than losing people, she gained people because they had to pull in closer. But that style of singing was what she had to say. It was a reflection of what she felt. It wasn't just a style that she had adopted. And she, like a lot of my favorite singers, Carmen McRae being another one of them, they knew that a love song, for them, a love song was not just a love song. A love song had all these different strains in it. It had conflict, and it had flickers of darkness and uncertainty and fear. And all these other things were swirling around that made a love song very multi-layered and compelling.
Go on. Sorry.
And
I'm still here.
And so I grew up on Carmen McRae, and all throughout the 80s, when I was kind of a kid, I went to the Blue Note to hear Carmen McRae every time she was there, and she was there every 6 months for a week. And I would go at least one of those nights, and I would sit in the front row center, the nostril seat, and I would sit at Carmen McRae's feet as though she were Buddha, trying to learn lessons about life from Carmen McRae. And it was Carmen McRae. She was the first person that I interviewed for what became my first book. And so I feel like not only that book, but my entire career as a writer is because of Carmen McRae. She is the godmother.
Wait, did you say the nostril seat? Is that like the opposite of the nosebleed seats? So like you're so close that
Is exactly the opposite. Yes. Very front.
I've actually never heard that, so that's why I asked. I've never heard of the nostril seats, but that's because you're so close to the stage that you're looking up and they can see your. Is that?
Carmen was up there sitting on a stool, and I was looking up at her with exactly that kind of fascination and awe. Yeah.
Wow. Is there, before I tell my George Michael story, my Careless Whisper story, is there something, anything other than all of the beautiful things that you said that you want to convey to people in general, not just musicians, or if you just artists or musicians, either way? Is there an overlying, kind of philosophical statement or?
Yes, there is. I think it's especially applicable to this year when so many people have adopted an fuck it attitude, and when people are feeling so understandably down about the present and the future. In my lowest times, I alluded earlier to one period of about 2 years when I was really low. I was in between my Chet Baker book and my Lena Horne book. And I found that what got me through was that every single day, if I could do something positive to help myself, even something simple. Every day I would work out, because I learned out that one workout is the equivalent of one antidepressant. Helped a lot. Every single day I would try and make a phone call, send an email, do a little bit of writing or work on a project that may or may not ever have seen the light of day, but just something to generate a kind of good energy, because good energy feeds on good energy, and good energy is forward energy. And it really helped me get through that time. And also, nothing comes from nothing. If I were just going to remain comatose on the sofa underneath a comforter, which we all go through every once in a while, I guess, but it wasn't going to take me where I needed to go. And I found that if I just try to keep some positive energy moving forward every single day, that it would build momentum. And I have unfailingly found that to be true in my life. And I would implore anyone who is struggling in this year, especially creative people, to just every day work on something, do something, reach out to somebody who can maybe be helpful to you or that you can help, because it'll build up steam. I really believe that. And I guess that's my message.
Absolutely beautiful. And there is actually science, and I'm sorry, people, I'm going to have to go back and do my research to give people actual details, but that science says that, there is a cause and effect. And so what you're doing will create more of what you're doing. And this is something that, part of the reason I started this podcast for me was, you're talking about laying on the couch with the blanket, so on and so forth. My version of that is sitting in my chair with my, my beverage or whatever, my blanket. And I don't know, at some point during the pandemic, I said, I should just go for a jog, So I went and I was like, I'll just run around the block, which at that time when I just started to jog, I couldn't run around the block. I just wasn't in that kind of shape. And now several months later, I'm actually going for real runs, 2.5, 3 miles. But man, my legs were sore. And I was like, I can only run around the block, man. That sucks. I should be able to do more. But I just kept doing it. I was like, even if I just ran down the street to the store, right? Just something. And so those little, I've also encouraged my students to write out just a few notes. If they have an idea, just write them down, notation software or with a pen, whatever you use, pencil, because you never know. That could be your symphony one day, or that could be something that you never want to do again. So you needed to get it out and throw it in the trash. And so I those are wise words. Thank you, James. And just because I'm such a weird guy and on some level a little self-centered, I want to tell my George Michael story.
Yes, you must.
But I'm not telling the tour bus story. I'm going to tell the Norway story. Is that cool?
Okay. Sure.
So going back to George Michael, when called you, James, and you said you were writing a biography on him. I was like, oh man, I got to tell you the story, man. And so I was in Norway. Everybody's so good with years. After 9/11, so 2003, 2005, before I had brain cancer, so before 2008, so mid 2000s, I'm in the small town in Norway called Stavanger. And also off of Stavanger is this small island called Hundvåg. And jeg snakker litt norsk, so I speak a little Norwegian. And Hundvåg means dog bay. And the reason I named it that is because during the bubonic plague, apparently everybody died. And the only thing alive were these wild dogs that lived on the island. I just think that's kind of funny, seeing as how we're going through a pandemic right now.
Yes.
Hey, let's just call it Dog Bay because, nobody lived. That was back when, like, if you sneezed, people were like, all right, God bless you. See you later, right? Anyway, so James is going to be a listener. I have to tell this story like I'm on talk radio. But so think parents out of town, on vacation, Norwegian boys want to have a party. So, we're in the living room of this one boy's house. By boys, he was like 20, I think, at the time. But those Scandinavian boys always looked like they're so much younger. But anyway, so we're having this party, and I'm kind of Uncle Andrew at that point. And they're like, oh, you play saxophone, man. Do you know that sax solo? And they didn't even know the name of it because they know it from that guy on YouTube that plays with his shirt off, and he's playing the Careless Whisper solo. Do you know who that is?
No.
You've never seen that guy?
No, I guess I should.
So this is, again, early YouTube days, 2000s. Dude has basically mullet and takes his shirt off and goes and plays the solo from Careless Whisper, like in shopping malls and shit like that. It's really, I can't believe you haven't seen it. It's amazing.
I'll find it.
So all these boys in Norway, so they're 20, may or may not have crossed paths with George Michael's music. I would assume not. We're like, oh, could you play that solo, man? And I was like, yeah. So I get my saxophone out, and the part of the story I don't remember. I may have taken my shirt off, but not really certain. And so I start playing the solo, and this one of the Norwegian boys, they're Vikings. He grabs me and is trying to dance with me, and I drop my saxophone because, well, I don't know. It was kind of hot, and I wasn't expecting it. And I didn't have my neck strap on, for those of you. And it was just this amazing evening. It was a great party. I don't think I even made it past the first 4 notes before this boy grabbed me and was trying to dance, and I dropped my saxophone. They're like, oh my God, is everything all right? But what you and I were talking about, James, is I like that story that I hadn't thought about in years, by the way. But I like the fact that George Michael's music made it all the way to Norway and all the way to this little island, to these kids, and via a conduit, which you don't even know about, which is, he calls himself the sax man. Oh, I'm going to get so much grief for not being prepared for this, but you'll find it on YouTube. Just type it in. Anyway, don't you find that fascinating that his music made it that far?
I find it completely fascinating and wonderful. Yeah. When he was so young when he wrote that too, he was in his very early 20s, just maybe 19. I have to check, 18, 19, thereabouts, that he was inspired enough to write something that would again become immortal. One of the most famous saxophone solos in history, probably.
Yeah, I mean, that would be a bold statement from either you or me, but I would say so. There's also that solo on Billy Joel, Just the Way You Are with Phil Woods.
That's Phil, exactly. Yeah, that's up there too. But if you ask people who do not normally study saxophone solos about saxophone solos they know, I think that the Careless Whisper solo would come up more often than most.
Well, it's not a solo. It's a written out. It's a composition.
Well, exactly. Yes, my terminology is not quite right.
No, but since I spoke to you a week
what-
ago, I've been talking to a lot of my friends, and some are like, oh yeah, it sounds composed to me. And some are like, no way, that's written out. I've gotten both reactions.
I will tell that whole story in my book because I have interviewed the saxophonist. And he will tell us all about what happened in the recording studio that day.
Oh, that's exciting.
Very interesting stuff, yeah. But no, by solo, I meant a lone saxophone.
Yeah, I know. Don't be so serious. I'm just saying that it's interesting that there are people who are musicians who think that that was improvised, and there are people who are like, yeah, it's composed.
I would never have thought that it was improvised because, within the structure of the song, you weren't just going to have a guy coming out with that. George, also knowing what I know about George's style, George was an extremely, I guess meticulous is the word. He thought everything through, and he wanted everything to unfold exactly as he wanted it. And he would not simply ask a musician to blow. It happened in later years, in fact.
He asked me to blow. I'm just all right.
He had very good taste. Years later, he worked with actually during Wham, and then later on too, he worked with a wonderful trumpet player named Steve Sidwell, whom I interviewed for my book. And Steve plays a beautiful solo, haunting solo on the album, on the track Older, the title track of the album Older.
Let's straighten that out. Steve Gregory is who you're talking about, the saxophone player, correct? Or
well, right now I've moved to another Steve named Steve Sidwell, who is a trumpet player.
okay.
And Steve is the trumpeter that you hear on the track Older. And that is improvised as far as I know. George didn't write that out, and it's really something. That's another great solo. But in terms of a lush, sexy, smoldering saxophone solo, I'm using the word solo again, but
It is a sax solo. I'm just saying that, when you think somebody's soloing, that they're probably improvising. But in the classical world, that's not true. There are, people soloing whatever, and it's all composed. So
yeah, that's true. But the point is that it sounds improvised. Hey, before you do your closing, would you quickly tell me what you told me on the phone about that solo that Steve Gregory played and that George Michael wrote? But you said that it's not like a profound piece of music technically.
right. I should clarify, because I'm assuming that a lot of my audience will be musicians and people that understand, notation versus improvisation. And as a solo, all I said is that if you handed somebody a saxophone and gave them a week or two to learn how to play simple notes, and they might not have the greatest sound, and they could play that solo. So technically, it's just not that profound. It's not that difficult to play.
So,
on a etheric level, to capture the essence of that moment when it was recorded, that Steve Gregory, and a couple people have complained, they're like, Steve Gregory, shouldn't his name be, something more exotic, something. And I was like, I don't know, I think it's kind of cool. But to capture that moment, which there are plenty of examples on YouTube where people are doing that solo, and they don't have the same energy. So the energy is hard to match, but as far as the notes, not that difficult.
well, what is the magic of that solo then?
I have no fucking idea. It's memorable. It's easy to remember. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're asking me to make a comment about something that would only be my opinion, and
but I would like your opinion. What makes that solo work?
Okay, first thing that came to my mind was, it's so bad, it's good.
Huh. Do you mean kitschy?
Sure. Cheesy.
Yeah.
It's so fucking bad that it's good.
I love that.
And I mean, his tone is great, his intonation is great, and the solo, or whatever, the composed solo is amazing, but it's just like, oh my God, I could write that shit in my sleep. And I that maybe has been, a detriment in my career, where I just hear these complicated rhythms and these really dense compositions, and that can scare people, and they don't remember them because there's just too much information. But that's just how my mind works. So I hear a solo like that, I'm like, yeah. It's like, this is so lame and so cheesy. It's so good. I mean, what are we talking about here? Liza Minnelli in New York, or what? Like this shit that's just like, all right, this is what is popular. People love that stuff.
Yes, people love that stuff. Yeah, and they remember it. It was tattooed on people's brains. That solo.
And I know that that's something that I would like to achieve while I'm still alive, especially because of having gone through brain cancer and getting a second chance. Is I want to imprint at least one piece of music that people cannot stop consuming or enjoying. At least one. Hopefully I can do more than one. But I mean, that remains to be seen. But
yeah, it'll come when you're least expecting it.
All right, so there's my answer from the universe that I haven't done it yet. I thought I did it with my song "I Love You." I thought people would just be like, "Oh man, that song is just like unforgettable," but it's too artsy fartsy. So I'll work on it.
Okay, it'll happen.
Right. All right. Thank you, James Gavin, for being here. I really appreciate it, and have a wonderful rest of your day. And I guess we'll see each other when we see each other after all this pandemic shit is over, or whatever.
Well, this has flown by, and I really thank you for including me on your show. It's a joy to talk to you. We covered a lot of grounds, a lot of interesting topics, and I love the way your mind works. So thanks for the pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you, sir. All right, folks, we'll talk to you. We'll see you on the next episode. Take care. See you later, James.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Constant Constance. Tune in every week for new conversations. And if you want even more, check out Andrew's Patreon for more exclusive content and additional conversations. Hosted and produced by Andrew D'Angelo. Edited and mixed by Lucy Little. Original music by Andrew D'Angelo and Maximilian Moore D'Angelo. Intro is Henrietta Weeks. Thanks so much. See you next time.
You fucking rocked it. Like, she doesn't know she says podcast, right? Like, she doesn't even